She thought she held the power of life and death, thought she had all power in her hands. But in a single moment, a terrible mistake, she ruined everything. An airline stewardess humiliated an elderly lady, slapping her in front of the passengers, without realizing who she had just laid hands on. Because the lady's husband, he was the owner of the airline. And now, as the plane lands, she doesn't just face an angry passenger, she's about to lose everything. Watch until the end, because what happens next no one on that flight could have imagined. The airport was packed with travelers, the familiar noise of voices mingling with the rolling of suitcase wheels and distant announcements. In the crowd, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a lady in her 70s, walked with quiet grace. She was neither in a hurry like most passengers, nor did she carry the eagerness of someone impatient to reach their destination. She had traveled too many times to feel rushed. Draped in a light blue shawl over a neatly pressed dress, her silver hair styled in a classic bun, she carried the dignity of someone who had experienced too many ups and downs to be swayed by trivial matters. In one hand she held a simple leather purse and in the other a small handbag. She reached the first-class boarding gate and handed her ticket to the gate agent, a polite young man who scanned the ticket and smiled. "Welcome, Mrs. Vance, have a wonderful flight." She gave a slight nod, appreciating his kindness, and then stepped onto the plane. She walked down the jet bridge and into the first-class cabin. Passengers were already settled, some adjusting their blankets, others sipping drinks. The air was filled with the subtle scent of new leather and faint perfume. Eleanor Vance approached seat 1B, gently placing her handbag at her feet. Before she could settle in, a voice cut through the quiet. "Excuse me, ma'am." Eleanor turned to see a tall flight attendant standing before her. Danielle Calloway had an air of command, her uniform crisp, her expression tight with annoyance. Eleanor nodded politely, "Yes." Danielle's eyes flicked to the boarding pass still in Eleanor's hand. "This is first class," she stated as if explaining something complex. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "I'm aware." Danielle hesitated, then held out her hand. "May I see your ticket?" Eleanor handed it over without a word. Danielle examined it, her eyes narrowing slightly. The name on the ticket matched the seat number, but she still looked skeptical. She returned the ticket with a forced smile. "Just a routine check." Eleanor nodded, understanding what was happening. It wasn't the first time someone had implied she didn't belong here. She sat down, adjusted her shawl and looked out the window. Minutes passed, the last of the passengers boarded, and the overhead compartments were closed. Eleanor reached for her handbag to retrieve a book when Danielle returned. This time, the flight attendant's smile was even more strained, as if she was suppressing her frustration. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I need you to leave." Eleanor turned to look at her. "Leave?" "Yes," Danielle said, crossing her arms. "It seems there's been a mistake. This seat isn't for you." Eleanor sat up a little straighter. "My ticket says 1B." Danielle let out a short sigh. "I know, but..." She glanced around as if searching for the right words, then said, "This seat is reserved for a certain type of passenger." A silence stretched between them, a few passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to hear. Eleanor took a slow breath. She had spent her life teaching students to stand up for themselves, raising a family that understood the value of dignity. She wasn't about to shrink now. "And what type of passenger am I?" she asked, her voice calm. Danielle's expression wavered for a moment. "What I mean is..." Eleanor raised a hand, stopping her. "If there's a real issue with my seat, I want to hear it from the captain." Danielle's jaw tightened, but before she could argue, another voice rang out. "What's the problem here?" A younger flight attendant had been watching from the galley. Emily Reed stepped forward, her expression uncertain. Unlike Danielle, her concern seemed genuine. Danielle snapped around to face Emily. "There's no problem," she said stiffly. "I was just about to ask Mrs. Gardner to move to..." "Move where?" Emily asked, frowning. Danielle hesitated. The economy cabin was full. She had expected Eleanor to leave quietly, to walk away without question. But now, with another crew member watching, she was trapped. Eleanor held her ground. "I'm not going anywhere." Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line, her frustration evident. Then, in a move no one expected, she reached out and grabbed Eleanor's arm. "Listen here, you old..." The slap was swift and sharp, the sound echoing through the cabin, silencing all the passengers. A gasp rippled through first class, a few heads turned, others froze. In utter shock, Danielle stood frozen, her hand still raised as if she couldn't believe what she had just done. Eleanor's head had tilted slightly from the force of the slap, but as she looked back at Danielle, her expression wasn't one of anger nor surprise but disappointment. The passengers sat motionless in their seats, No one moving, no one speaking. The young flight attendant, Emily, was pale, her mouth slightly open. Eleanor said nothing, simply bent down to pick up her phone and type a short message. Then, with quiet dignity, she folded her hands and waited. And all the while, Danielle Calloway had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Danielle's breath was rapid, her chest heaving as she stared at Eleanor. She hadn't meant to do it, or at least, not planned to do it in front of so many people. A few passengers shifted in their seats, some whispering to each other, others pretending not to see anything. Emily, the younger flight attendant, looked horrified. "You just—" she began, her voice barely a whisper. Danielle straightened up, her eyes darting around. "You didn't hear anything," she muttered. Eleanor remained calm, placing her phone on the armrest. She didn't rub her cheek, didn't cry, she just looked at Danielle with the same calm, steady expression as before. Emily's voice was louder. "You just hit a passenger." Danielle snapped around. "Stay out of this." The tension in the air was suffocating. A man sitting across from them cleared his throat as if about to speak, but quickly looked away as Danielle's eyes flicked in his direction. Others held their phones in their hands, though it was unclear if they were recording or just pretending to be busy. Eleanor didn't need them to speak up, she knew how these moments went. No one wanted to get involved when there was conflict, she had seen it before, how people chose silence over discomfort. Danielle took a step back, smoothing her uniform as if fixing her appearance could erase what had just happened. "I need you to leave," she repeated, though her voice had lost some of its edge. Eleanor didn't respond, Danielle's hands clenching into fists at her sides. "Fine, if you won't listen, I'll call security." She turned on her heel, striding towards the front of the plane. Emily remained frozen for a moment before snapping out of it and kneeling beside Eleanor. "Are you okay?" Eleanor gave a slight nod. "I'm fine." Emily hesitated. Should I call someone?" Eleanor glanced at her phone. "I already did." Emily blinked, confused. "Call who?" Eleanor gave a mysterious smile but didn't answer. She picked up her handbag and placed it neatly on her lap. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Danielle reached the microphone near the cockpit. She pressed the button, her voice strained with forced professionalism. "Captain, we have a situation in first class. A passenger is refusing to leave a seat that isn't hers. I need ground security to remove her from the plane before takeoff." A pause, then the captain's voice came over the speaker. "Passenger's name?" Danielle sighed, annoyed. "Eleanor Gardner." Silence. Danielle frowned. "Captain?" Another long pause, then the speaker crackled to life again. But this time the voice that responded wasn't the captain's, but a deeper, calmer and far more dangerous one. "This is Charles Gardner. Do you want to repeat what you just said?" Danielle's stomach tightened, her finger hovering over the intercom button, but she couldn't press it, couldn't move. Emily, still kneeling beside Eleanor, let out a small gasp of realization. "Oh no," she whispered. Danielle swallowed hard. "Charles Gardner?" she repeated, as if saying the name aloud would change anything. The voice on the other end was sharp, unwavering. "Yes, my wife, Eleanor Gardner, the woman you just laid hands on." The passengers who had been pretending not to hear all looked up at once, a wave of tension spreading through the cabin, heavier than ever. Danielle's blood ran cold, she had no idea what she had just done. Danielle's hand trembled slightly as she stepped back from the microphone, her heart pounding in her ears. Charles Gardner, just the name itself sent shivers down her spine. She had worked for the airline for years, long enough to know the names of the most powerful people, the influential figures behind the company, and Charles Gardner, he wasn't just a shareholder, he was the majority owner, the man who had built the airline from the ground up, the man who held the power to end careers with a single phone call. Her throat was dry, she had just slapped his wife. The passengers in first class were no longer pretending to be uninterested, some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others stared openly, waiting to see what would happen next. The intercom crackled again, and this time Charles's voice was even calmer, colder. "Miss Calloway, I asked you a question, do you want to repeat what you just said?" Danielle's lips parted, but no words came out. Emily, still kneeling beside Eleanor, felt the weight of the moment, then spoke softly. "Mrs. Gardner, would you like me to call the captain?" Eleanor shook her head slightly. "No need." She picked up her phone again, typed a short message, then gently placed it back on the armrest, folding her hands in her lap, looking as calm as ever. She was waiting. Danielle's fingers trembled, she needed to fix this and she needed to do it quickly. She cleared her throat and pressed the intercom button again, forcing her voice to sound professional. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said quickly. Mrs. Gardner's seat was definitely mishandled and I was just trying to clarify. Charles interrupted her. So you laid hands on her? Danielle closed her eyes for half a second, her pulse quickening. The intercom went dead. Silence. Then the cockpit door swung open. Captain Jonathan Pierce stepped out, his face expressionless. He was a man nearing 60, with a few silver strands at his temples, his voice rarely needing to be loud to command. He adjusted his cap, then spoke with a firmness that made the hairs on Danielle's arms stand on end. "Miss Calloway," he said, his tone steady, "follow me now." Danielle hesitated. "Captain, I?" He didn't let her finish. That wasn't a request. A heavy silence fell over first class as the passengers watched the scene unfold. Emily stood up, taking a step back as Danielle slowly turned and walked towards the cockpit. Captain Pierce ushered her inside, slamming the door shut. Emily looked down at Eleanor, then at the phone on the armrest. A new message had arrived. "Charles Gardner, stay put, I'm handling it." Emily's stomach churned. She had a bad feeling that whatever was about to happen next wouldn't be pretty. Inside the cockpit, Danielle stood rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her breaths shallow. The cramped space felt smaller than usual, the hum of the engines roaring beneath them. Captain Pierce settled into his seat, his expression unreadable. Flight Supervisor Richard Hale appeared on the cockpit communication screen, his expression equally stern. Clearly he had been brought into the situation, and that was never a good sign. Danielle licked her lips, trying to stay calm. "Captain, I?" Pierce held up a hand. Silence. Her mouth snapped shut. He took a slow breath, rubbing his temples before speaking. "Do you know what you've just done?" Danielle's pulse quickened. She knew, of course she knew, but she couldn't admit it. "Captain, I was just trying to follow procedure. I thought the woman was in the wrong seat." Richard Hale interrupted, his voice cold through the speaker. "You slapped the airline owner's wife." Danielle winced, as if hearing it spoken aloud made it worse. Pierce leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Who gave you the right to lay hands on a passenger?" Danielle swallowed hard. I lost my temper." The two men exchanged a look, a dangerous one. Richard's voice was hard. "So you admit it?" Danielle realized her mistake immediately. "No, what I meant was." She quickly corrected herself. "I didn't mean to, not intentionally, I was just trying to enforce the seating arrangements and she wouldn't listen." Pierce sighed, shaking his head. "That's enough." Danielle bit her lip, her chest tightening. "Captain, I can apologize, I can go out there and—" Richard's voice cut through the static of the communication screen. "Too late." Danielle's hands were clammy with sweat. Captain Pierce leaned back in his seat. "Orders from Mr. Gardner himself, you are immediately suspended from duty for the rest of this flight." Danielle's heart stopped for a second. What?" Richard continued, his tone unwavering. "Upon landing you will not report to the crew debriefing, instead, you will be escorted to the administrative office, where a formal review will take place." Danielle felt lightheaded. "You're suspending me?" Pierce's expression darkened. "We don't make the rules here, Miss Calloway, Charles Gardner does." Danielle's nails dug into her palms, her stomach churning so violently she thought she might vomit. Pierce nodded towards the door. "Now you will return to first class, collect your belongings and take the crew jump seat at the back of the plane. You will not interact with passengers for the remainder of this flight." Danielle stood frozen. She had never ever been ordered to sit in the crew area like a scolded trainee. It was humiliating. She opened her mouth to protest, but the captain's next words crushed any remaining argument. "If you refuse," he said slowly, "I will have the air marshal on board remove you from duty immediately." Danielle's blood ran cold. The air marshal? There was no escape for her, no excuse that could fix this. After a long, trembling breath, she reluctantly nodded, her hand shaking as she reached for the door. Captain Pierce didn't watch her leave. Richard Hale said nothing more. The door slammed shut behind her, and as she walked through first class, the passengers who had witnessed everything turned to watch her. Her face burned with shame, her head hung low. She had never been so publicly humiliated, and she had a sickening feeling that this was just the beginning of her downfall. Danielle walked stiffly down the aisle, her hands clenched at her sides, her face burning as she felt every eye on her. Whispers had started as soon as she left the cockpit. The previously silent passengers now had the courage to murmur, "She's the one who hit her. Did you see the captain's face? She's done for. I heard she's been removed from duty." Danielle's chest tightened. She had always prided herself on being in control, on giving orders, but now she wasn't the enforcer, she was the one being humiliated in front of the people she used to look down on. She grabbed her bag from the overhead compartment, her fingers trembling. She had spent years working her way up the seniority ladder, years building her reputation, and now she was reduced to this. Emily stood a few steps away, watching with a conflicted expression. She hadn't said a word since Danielle left the cockpit, but her eyes said it all. Danielle turned away without a word, walking past the first-class passengers, her head down, but before she could disappear, a voice stopped her in her tracks. "Miss Calloway." Her stomach clenched painfully. She slowly turned around, already knowing who had spoken. Mrs. Eleanor Gardner sat in the same spot, her posture upright, her hands neatly folded in her lap. She hadn't moved an inch, hadn't raised her voice once during the entire ordeal, but somehow she was in complete control. Danielle forced a weak smile. "Yes, Mrs. Gardner?" Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, then in the calmest, clearest voice she asked, "Do you still believe I don't belong in this seat?" The words landed like a slap in the face. Danielle's mouth opened, but no words came out. The nearby passengers had gone completely silent, waiting for her answer. Eleanor's eyes were steady, patient. "I want an answer," she said. Danielle felt her body tense. She knew what the right answer was. She knew she should apologize, should bow her head and beg for forgiveness, but her pride wouldn't allow it. She swallowed hard. I made a mistake." Eleanor nodded slightly as if expecting that weak response. Then she said, "I hope it's a mistake you won't repeat." Danielle's hands tightened on the strap of her bag. Without another word, Eleanor turned her face towards the window, dismissing her. This time, the passengers didn't hide their reactions. Some looked pleased, others shook their heads, a few even whispered, "Serves her right." Danielle's humiliation was complete. She turned on her heel and walked away, each step heavier than the last. As she passed through first class, heading towards the crew area in the back, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't afraid of what would happen when the plane landed, she was afraid of what Charles Gardner was planning next. Danielle reached the back of the plane, her breathing uneven, her hand gripping her bag tightly. She had never felt so small, so exposed. Every step down that aisle was a public walk of shame, and she could still feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on her back. She slid into the crew jump seat, her uniform suddenly feeling suffocating. The hum of the engines filled the silence around her, but it couldn't drown out the thoughts racing through her mind. She had never ever been removed from duty mid-flight. Even with the most difficult passengers, she had always been the one making the decisions, setting the rules, but now she was nothing more than a powerless crew member, sitting in the back like a rookie on her first day. Emily appeared near the galley, hovering uncertainly. She hesitated before speaking. "Are you okay?" Danielle gritted her teeth. "I don't need your pity." Emily sighed and leaned against the storage compartment. "It's not pity," she said. "I just don't think you understand how bad this is." Danielle glared at her. "I know exactly how bad this is." Emily crossed her arms. "Do you?" Danielle was silent. Emily's voice was softer. "You hit the wife of the man who owns this airline." She shook her head. "You don't get a warning, you don't get a disciplinary meeting where they just scold you, you're going to be erased." Danielle stiffened. "They can't fire me without due process." Emily scoffed. "This isn't a normal situation. Danielle, this isn't about you messing up a seating arrangement. You laid hands on someone, and not just anyone, but Mrs. Eleanor Gardner." Danielle opened her mouth to argue, but what could she say? Emily leaned forward slightly. "I don't think you understand." She didn't yell, didn't demand anything, she just sat there and sent a message, just one message, and now you're sitting here, stripped of your position. She let those words sink in before adding, "What do you think is waiting for you when we land?" Danielle's throat was dry. It was the one thought she had been trying to ignore, because she knew deep down that Charles Gardner wasn't the type to let this slide. She gritted her teeth. "Maybe I can fix this." Emily raised an eyebrow. "How?" Danielle took a deep breath, trying to convince herself as much as Emily. "Maybe if I apologize, a sincere apology, he won't push for termination." Emily tilted her head. "And you think an apology will be enough?" Danielle hesitated, she wanted to believe it, but something about Charles's cold, controlled tone over the intercom terrified her. Emily glanced towards the front of the plane. "You should be hoping for more than an apology." Danielle frowned. "Like what?" Emily sighed. "Like a miracle." Danielle stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap, because for the first time in her career, she realized she might have made an unrecoverable mistake. The plane flew smoothly through the sky, but inside the cabin the tension hadn't subsided. Passengers still whispered about what had happened, a few glancing towards first class, where Eleanor sat with the quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the ordeal. Eleanor could feel the shift in energy, how people around her suddenly acknowledged her presence, where before they had ignored her. Some of them now wore expressions of silent guilt, as if realizing they had witnessed an injustice and said nothing. She didn't need their apologies, she had sent a message and she knew that was enough. At the front of the plane, Captain Pierce sat in the cockpit, gripping the controls with a steady but calm expression. His co-pilot glanced at him, then at the screen, where an in-flight message from the airline's executive office had just arrived. Emergency security details will be waiting at the gate. All crew members involved in an incident are to report for immediate review as per Charles Gardner's orders. The co-pilot breathed out slowly. Doesn't sound good. Pierce didn't take his eyes off the flight instruments. Not for Calloway. A few minutes later, another crackle came through the radio. Captain Pierce, this is ground control. Mr. Gardner requests to be connected to the flight. The co-pilot glanced at Pierce. He knew this was coming. He pressed the communication button. Connect him. There was a brief pause, then a voice came through the cockpit, calm, unwavering, dangerous. This is Charles Gardner. The co-pilot instantly stiffened, his fingers freezing on the controls. Pierce cleared his throat. Mr. Gardner, this is Captain Pierce. I assume you've been fully briefed on the situation. I have, Charles replied, his tone measured, unreadable. I want confirmation that the flight attendant in question has been removed from duty. Pierce nodded. She's sitting in the crew area for the remainder of the flight. A long pause, then Charles spoke again. Upon landing, she is to be escorted directly to the airline's administrative office. No breaks, no crew debriefing. I want a full incident report before she leaves the airport. Pierce exchanged a glance with the co-pilot. Understood, sir. Charles's voice remained calm. And one more thing. Captain Pierce straightened up. Yes, sir? Another pause, then in a voice so sharp it sent a chill down the captain's spine, Charles said, Tell Miss Calloway to enjoy her last flight. The intercom went dead, the cockpit silent. The co-pilot let out a low whistle. He didn't say last flight of the day. No, Pierce muttered, adjusting the controls. He didn't. Meanwhile, in the crew jump seat, Danielle sat motionless, staring at the floor. She had heard everything and for the first time, real fear crept into her chest. Danielle sat rigid in the cramped crew jump seat, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The words echoed in her head, repeating like a slow-motion nightmare. Tell Miss Calloway to enjoy her last flight. Her last flight. The meaning was unmistakable. Her career, the one she had worked years to build, the power she had clung to, the authority she thought she held over passengers, was about to vanish before her eyes. She gripped the edge of the seat, her nails digging into the fabric. No, this can't be happening. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, she had enforced the rules, she had even clashed with superiors at times, but this wasn't just a complaint, this wasn't just a passenger issue, this was the man who controlled the airline, personally overseeing her removal. Emily stood a few steps away in the galley, pretending to organize drink trays, but she had heard everything too. The way she avoided looking at Danielle only made things worse. Danielle's voice trembled, almost unrecognizable. He can't just fire me outright. Emily sighed, glancing at her. Danielle, do you really think you'll keep your job after this? Danielle gritted her teeth. There's a process. There has to be a review, a hearing. Emily shook her head. No, there isn't. Danielle's stomach clenched painfully. Emily leaned against the counter, lowering her voice. Do you think this is like a normal HR complaint? It's not. You laid hands on a passenger, and not just any passenger, but Mrs. Eleanor Gardner. Danielle opened her mouth to argue, but Emily didn't let her speak. She didn't call security. Emily's voice was almost pitying. She didn't demand an apology, she didn't yell or cause a scene, she just sat there and sent a message. Emily sighed. And now, the most powerful man in the airline industry has decided your fate. Danielle felt the pressure in her chest worsen. This was really happening. She had made a mistake, a big one, and there was no way to fix it. The flight continued, the cabin eerily silent. First-class passengers didn't make their usual requests. The energy had shifted, as if everyone knew what had happened and what was coming. Eleanor still hadn't moved, she sat comfortably in her seat, looking out the window as if the storm raging around her had nothing to do with her. Danielle forced herself to take a deep breath. Maybe, just maybe, there was still one last chance. She straightened up, her hand trembling slightly as she looked at Emily. I'll apologize. Emily raised an eyebrow. Now? Danielle nodded quickly, standing up. If I tell Mrs. Gardner that I was wrong, if I show remorse for what I did, maybe? She trailed off. Maybe Charles Gardner will reconsider, maybe I can save myself. Without waiting for permission, Danielle turned and started walking towards first class, her legs heavy as if fighting against her own despair. She needed to fix this, but when she reached the front of the cabin standing beside Eleanor's seat, she realized something. Eleanor didn't even look up. She knew Danielle was coming, and she wasn't in a hurry to acknowledge her presence. Danielle swallowed hard, standing beside Eleanor's seat, her hands clasped tightly together. The older woman didn't move, didn't turn to acknowledge her. She sat comfortably, still looking out the window as if Danielle's presence meant nothing. The weight of the silence was unbearable. Danielle licked her lips, trying to steady her voice. "Mrs. Gardner," she said, trying to keep her tone polite, but there was no response. Nearby passengers noticed what was happening, some glancing discreetly, while others watched openly. They could also feel the thick tension hanging in the air. Danielle's fingers trembled, but she forced herself to continue. "Mrs. Gardner, I want to apologize." Finally, Eleanor tilted her head slightly, not enough to face her, just enough to acknowledge her existence, her expression still unreadable. Danielle took a small breath. I realize that I acted improperly. I shouldn't have questioned your seat, and I certainly shouldn't have." Her voice wavered, but she tried to continue. "I shouldn't have laid hands on you." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, observing her. She showed no anger nor satisfaction. She showed indifference, and somehow that was worse. Danielle tried again, her voice this time a little more desperate. I regret what I did. It was unprofessional, and I hope you can forgive me." Eleanor let the silence linger for a long moment, then she turned fully to face Danielle, her eyes sharp, unwavering. "Forgiveness," she said softly, "is not something that erases consequences." Danielle's stomach tightened. Eleanor leaned back in her seat, folding her hands in her lap. "I appreciate your apology, Miss Calloway," she continued, her voice calm. "But tell me, are you apologizing because you are genuinely remorseful?" Her eyes pierced Danielle as if she already knew the answer. "Or because you were caught?" Danielle's throat tightened. The surrounding passengers pretended not to hear, but their faces showed they were listening to every word. Danielle hesitated. Eleanor raised a finger. "Before you answer, think carefully, because if you say the wrong thing at this moment, it will be the last thing you say as an employee of this airline." Danielle felt her heart pound in her chest. This woman didn't yell, didn't threaten her directly, but her words carried more weight than anything Danielle had faced in her entire career. Her entire career was balancing on this moment. She had two choices. She could admit the truth, accept responsibility and hope it would mitigate whatever Charles Gardner was planning for her, or she could lie, pretend she was truly sorry, but something told her that Eleanor Gardner would see through that immediately. The silence stretched, the air around them thick. Danielle gripped her hands at her sides. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice smaller this time, "not just because I was caught, but because I was wrong." Eleanor's expression remained unreadable, her eyes still holding that calm, patient power. Danielle's throat was dry. "I should have treated you with respect," she added quickly, "and I should have thought before I acted. I didn't, and I regret it." Finally, Eleanor tilted her head slightly, considering her. Danielle felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she would be willing to talk to Charles, maybe she could convince him to let her keep her job. Then Eleanor sighed and shook her head just a little. Danielle's stomach dropped. "I believe you regret it," Eleanor said simply, "but I don't believe you've learned anything from this." Danielle gasped. "What?" Eleanor raised a hand. I'm not the one you need to convince." She glanced at her phone, tapping it once before sliding it into her purse. "And I've said all I need to say." Danielle's mouth opened slightly. Was that it? Eleanor had sealed her fate. She felt her hands clammy with sweat, her vision blurring slightly with panic. She had thought that if she apologized, if she swallowed her pride, it would be enough, but Eleanor had never held her career in her hands. Charles Gardner did, and he was waiting for her on the ground. Danielle took a shaky step back, her legs feeling weak as she turned away from Eleanor. Whispers started again as she walked towards the crew area, the passengers' voices now barely restrained. "She's done for. I almost feel sorry for her." Almost. Danielle's hands clenched into fists. She wasn't ready to give up, but it didn't matter because the moment the plane touched down, she would have no choice. The cabin was eerily silent as the plane began its descent, the gradual tilt downwards almost imperceptible under the tension that filled the air. Passengers shifted in their seats, fastening their seatbelts as the overhead announcement reminded them to prepare for landing. Danielle, however, couldn't hear anything but her own pounding heartbeat. She sat in the crew jump seat, staring blankly at the floor, her fingers gripping her uniform so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She had completely lost control, her mind racing, searching for some way to fix this, some way to extricate herself from the disaster waiting for her at the gate, but no matter how she turned it over in her head, she kept coming back to the same conclusion. There was no escape. She had tried to apologize, she had tried to swallow her pride, but it was all for nothing, because Charles Gardner had made his decision. Her fate was sealed. Emily stood near the drink cart, watching Danielle from a distance. She had seen many crew members get into trouble before, people who had made mistakes, people who had violated procedures, but this wasn't something that could be brushed aside. Emily hesitated before stepping closer. "Are you okay?" Danielle gave a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "No." Emily sighed. "I didn't think so." Danielle rubbed her face, her hands trembling slightly. "Maybe I can still talk to him, maybe if I explain that it was just. Emily interrupted, her voice soft but firm. Danielle looked up at her, Emily's expression unreadable. "What are you going to say? That it was a misunderstanding? That you were following procedure?" She tilted her head slightly. "Because that's not going to work and you know it." Danielle swallowed hard, her throat dry. Emily leaned against the galley counter. "Do you really not understand why this happened?" Danielle frowned. "Of course I do." Emily shook her head. "I don't think you do." She crossed her arms. "You didn't just take someone's wrong seat, Danielle. You didn't just mix up tickets. You looked at her and decided on the spot that she didn't belong in first class." Danielle flinched. "That's not how it was." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Then how was it?" Danielle couldn't answer because they both knew the truth. Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't think you meant for it to go this far, but the fact that it did means you have to take responsibility for it." Danielle breathed heavily, shaking her head. "Even if I did, it wouldn't make a difference. I'm done for, aren't I?" Emily didn't answer, she didn't need to. The plane shuddered slightly as the landing gear deployed, and the captain's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all tray tables are in their upright positions. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." Danielle sat motionless, her breath shallow. It was over. She had spent years working in the airline industry, thinking herself untouchable, thinking she had the right to decide who belonged where, who deserved to be treated how, but now she was about to step off this plane with nothing. She gritted her teeth, fighting the rising panic within her. She had always been the one enforcing the rules, the one making the announcements, the one holding power over passengers who had no choice but to listen, but today she held no power, today she was the one being dismissed. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling gently along the runway. A few passengers gave a half-hearted applause, an old habit even when the landing was uneventful. To Danielle the sound was mocking. She barely noticed as the plane slowed, rolling towards the gate. Her body felt detached, numb, as if she was watching the moment unfold from outside herself. Then came the final announcement. "Welcome to our destination. Local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until the fasten seatbelt sign is turned off, and thank you for flying with us." The ding of the fasten seatbelt sign turning off sent a jolt through Danielle's body. It was done. Emily gave her one last look before moving to begin the standard deplaning procedure, but there was nothing standard about what was waiting outside that door. Passengers stood up, gathering their belongings, stretching after the long flight. Some moved quickly to exit the plane, eager to disembark, but many lingered, watching, waiting. Danielle could feel it, they all wanted to see what was about to happen. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and forced herself to stand, but as soon as she did, her entire body went cold, because standing at the end of the jet bridge, visible through the open door, was a group of airline executives, and at their center was Charles Gardner. His face was unreadable, his suit impeccable, his presence commanding attention without him having to say a word, but what really made Danielle's stomach drop, what sent her nerves into complete disarray, was the fact that two uniformed security officers stood beside him. A ripple of whispers spread through first class, some passengers freezing, others craning their necks for a better view. Eleanor Gardner sat unperturbed, slowly gathering her belongings, as if she had all the time in the world. Danielle felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't just a meeting, this wasn't just a disciplinary review, she was about to be publicly escorted off the plane like a criminal, and it suddenly dawned on her, this wasn't just about losing her job, this was about making an example of her. Danielle stood frozen in the crew jump seat, her body refusing to move. The plane door gaped open like a yawning void, leading her straight into her own downfall. Charles Gardner didn't move, he stood just outside the entrance, his posture relaxed but his expression unreadable. The executives around him were stiff, their eyes cold, professional. The two security officers stood on either side of them, carrying the silent authority that only comes when someone is about to be removed. The moment stretched, so tense, so unbearable, it felt like the entire plane had stopped breathing. First-class passengers were all facing forward, some watching openly, others pretending to fidget with their bags while glancing at the scene unfolding before them. Even those who had ignored everything earlier were now fully focused. This wasn't just a normal disembarkation, this was a punishment. Danielle swallowed hard, forcing herself to step forward, but her legs were stiff, as if her body was resisting the humiliation waiting for her on the jet bridge. Emily stood near the galley watching the scene unfold. She didn't say anything, but her face said it all. She knew this wasn't just an escort out of the airport, this was Charles Gardner making an example of her. Danielle's chest tightened. Maybe if she spoke first, if she explained herself, if she just said the right thing, but before she could open her mouth, Charles Gardner finally moved. With slow precision, he stepped forward, standing right at the plane's door, his eyes locking onto Danielle. "Miss Calloway." Her stomach dropped. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't threatening, it didn't need to be. There was a sharp control in it, a power that didn't need to shout. Danielle straightened her back, trying to salvage whatever dignity she had left. "Mr. Gardner?" she said carefully. Charles's expression didn't change. He didn't look at her with anger, nor was he impressed by her sudden change in tone. He just tilted his head slightly. "I assume you know why I'm here." Danielle's fingers trembled at her sides, she couldn't give the wrong answer. She cleared her throat. "I understand there's been an issue, and I deeply regret any misunderstanding with your wife." "Stop." Danielle's words died in her throat. Charles looked at her sharply. "This isn't about misunderstandings, and I don't care what you regret." The entire cabin was dead silent. Passengers, crew, even the captain who had just stepped out of the cockpit stood frozen. Danielle felt the floor slipping beneath her. Charles exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "What I care about is why you thought you had the right to lay hands on a passenger." Danielle's pulse quickened. He had gone straight to the worst part, the undeniable part. She opened her mouth, trying to find something to say, but her mind couldn't form a suitable excuse. How could she explain something like that? How could she justify something that had no justification? Her hesitation was all the answer Charles needed. He gave a single nod, turning to one of the airline executives. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice still perfectly calm. "Danielle Calloway is permanently terminated from this airline." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Danielle gasped softly, barely able to process. "Wait." Charles raised a hand. "We're not done." Danielle's legs went weak. He turned back to her. "You will be escorted directly off this flight, your contract is terminated, and your employment record will reflect that you were fired for gross misconduct." The whispers behind her grew louder, passengers murmuring, some reacting openly. Danielle's heart pounded. "Mr. Gardner, please?" Charles's expression finally changed, a flicker of mild amusement passing over his face. Danielle froze. It was the look of a man who had heard this before, a man who had seen people beg to undo what they had done. "You want a second chance?" he asked, his voice soft but sharp. Danielle nodded quickly. I do." He looked at her as if weighing the request, then he chuckled, and it wasn't a kind sound. "You had your chance," he said simply, "the moment you looked at my wife and decided she didn't belong here." Danielle gasped. Charles stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You could have stopped at questioning her seat," he whispered. "You could have stopped at making her prove she had a first-class ticket." His eyes darkened. "But you didn't, you made a choice, Miss Calloway." Danielle felt herself trembling. "You thought you had power over her," he continued, his voice like steel, "and now you have nothing." Danielle was speechless. She knew in that moment that this wasn't just about her job, her career was over. Even if she tried to find work elsewhere, this would follow her. No airline, no reputable company in the industry would risk hiring someone personally fired by Charles Gardner. Her breaths were rapid, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real, this couldn't be happening, but it was. Charles stepped back and gave a simple nod to the security officers. "Escort her off." Danielle felt her knees weaken as one of the officers gently but firmly motioned for her to move. She didn't move, she couldn't, but she had no choice. Passengers openly stared, some even raised their phones as they whispered to each other. Danielle's face burned with humiliation. She had spent years dictating the rules on this plane, and now she was being let off it like a problem to be dealt with. Her legs were heavy as she walked towards the exit, the whispers growing louder, the steps unbearable. and as she passed Eleanor Gardner's seat she heard a soft, patient voice. "I hope you remember this," Eleanor said calmly, her eyes still fixed on the window. Danielle felt her stomach drop. She forced herself to keep walking, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but as she stepped off the plane, feeling the weight of her entire career collapsing, she knew one thing for sure. She would never forget this moment because Charles Gardner hadn't just fired her, he had erased her. Danielle stepped onto the jet bridge, her legs unsteady, her hands clammy with sweat. The air in the enclosed tunnel felt thick, suffocating, but she couldn't stop. The two security officers flanked her, keeping a close but respectful distance, not touching her, not forcing her, but making sure she understood she was no longer in control. She was no longer a respected crew member, no longer a person of authority, she was a burden to be removed. Each step felt heavier than the last, the distant airport noise muffled by the ringing in her ears as the reality truly set in. She wasn't just losing her job, she was losing everything. Her reputation, her career, the respect she had earned from the crew over the years. It was all gone, and worst of all, she had brought it upon herself. She recalled the moment she first saw Eleanor Gardner on the plane, how she instantly assumed she didn't belong, how she questioned her, belittled her, and ultimately humiliated her. She had thought she held the power in that moment, but in reality she was digging her own grave. They reached the end of the jet bridge, where a team of airline administrative staff waited. A stern-looking woman in a navy blue suit, holding a tablet, glanced up as they approached. Her name tag read Rebecca Lynn, Senior Flight Operations Manager. She barely acknowledged Danielle before turning to one of the security officers. "She's with me," Rebecca said coldly. Danielle opened her mouth, trying to find something, anything, to say that might change what was happening, but Rebecca had already turned on her heel, expecting Danielle to follow. Danielle swallowed the lump of humiliation in her throat and did as she was told. The walk through the airport terminal was as brutal as the walk off the plane. Passengers moved about, some rushing to catch flights, others waiting at gates, completely unaware of the storm raging inside her, but some had been on the flight, some had witnessed what happened, and they recognized her. She could feel their eyes on her, some staring openly, others whispering behind their hands, some even raising their phones, pretending to check notifications but really taking pictures. Danielle felt her stomach churn violently. She had been the enforcer, the one implementing airline policies, the one handling problem passengers, and now she was the story, the viral news article waiting to happen. She lowered her head, her nails digging into her palms. Maybe, just maybe, if she acted like she was still in control, she could salvage something from this mess. Rebecca led her into a private elevator, swiping her badge to access a restricted area of the airport. The doors closed behind them, sealing them in a silent, tense space. Danielle forced herself to speak. "Ms. Lynn," she began, keeping her voice even, professional, as if she still had the right to engage in a normal conversation. Rebecca didn't look at her, she just glanced at the tablet, scrolling through some report. Danielle hesitated, but continued, "I understand that Mr. Gardner is upset, and I take full responsibility for what happened." Rebecca's sharp exhale cut her off. Finally she looked up, her expression cold and unreadable. "Miss Calloway," she said, her voice firm but controlled, "this isn't a disciplinary hearing." Danielle frowned. Rebecca's eyes sharpened. "There's no performance review, no suspension, no formal process for you to plead your case." She tilted the tablet towards Danielle. "It's over." Danielle's heart pounded in her chest as she reading the document on the screen. Her termination letter was drafted, signed, and effective immediately. Danielle's hands trembled as she stared at it. "No, there has to be." Rebecca cut her off. "You are permanently banned from employment with this airline, effective today." She swiped the screen, pulling up another document, and at the direct request of Mr. Gardner, "A flag has been placed on your employment record." Danielle felt her stomach drop. A flag, a permanent mark on her record, that would show up in every airline database, every future job application, every background check. She had heard of these before, only the worst incidents resulted in a flagged record. It wasn't just termination, it was a blacklist. Rebecca looked at her bluntly. "You will not be hired at any airline affiliated with our parent company. Your name has been forwarded to other major carriers per our industry agreement." She glanced back at the screen. That includes over 40 airlines worldwide. Danielle's vision blurred. This wasn't just about losing her job, this was the end of her career. The aviation world was small, tightly knit, interconnected. Once your name was flagged, you were permanently excluded. It didn't matter how much experience she had, it didn't matter how many flights she had worked, none of it mattered anymore. She had just become unemployable. She staggered back slightly, gripping the elevator railing for balance. Rebecca remained unmoved. "You will be escorted to retrieve your personal belongings from the crew office, then you will be taken straight to the airport exit, where you will return your uniform and badge." Danielle's mouth opened and closed. She couldn't say anything, couldn't do anything. Rebecca pressed a button on the tablet, then looked back at Danielle with one final directive. "You are never to board one of our planes again," she said simply. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. 2 more security officers were waiting. Danielle took a slow, trembling step forward as she stepped out, the weight of her mistakes crashing down all at once. She had never imagined her career ending like this, but as she walked down the hallway flanked by security, she realized something even worse than losing her job. She had always believed she was untouchable, that she could get away with anything as long as she had seniority, as long as she had authority, but no one was untouchable, especially when the power you thought you had was never yours to begin with. Danielle's steps felt slow, heavy, as if she was walking towards her own execution. The hallway stretched ahead, long and sterile, lined with frosted windows and glass doors leading to airline administrative offices. Every few steps, she passed uniformed personnel, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, some recognizing her, some just seeing the tight escort around her and immediately understanding. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with satisfaction. Danielle had made a lot of enemies over the years, crew members she had belittled, new recruits she had pushed too hard, employees she had written up for minor infractions, just to prove she could. She had ruled with authority, demanded respect, and never worried about the consequences of her actions until now. She could feel it, the eyes, the whispers, the realization spreading through the airline that the powerful, untouchable Danielle Calloway had fallen, and she had fallen hard. Her throat burned as she reached the flight crew administration office, where a receptionist barely glanced at her before pressing a button under the desk. Seconds later, a young supervisor named Ethan Vaughn stepped out, holding a folder. Danielle had barely interacted with him before. He was new, still finding his place in the airline's hierarchy. If this were any other day, she probably would have dismissed him entirely, but now he was the one handling her termination. The universe had a cruel sense of humor. Ethan gave a forced professional smile, but there was no kindness in it, just procedural efficiency. "Miss Calloway," he said, glancing at the security officers before nodding towards a door beside him, "we'll complete the final steps of your termination process inside." Danielle didn't move immediately. She still couldn't believe this was happening. Just yesterday she was a respected senior flight attendant, giving orders, supervising crew members, making decisions, and now she was standing in an office like a criminal, waiting to be processed out of the only career she had ever known. The humiliation was unbearable. Ethan cleared his throat, reminding her that she had no choice. Danielle swallowed her pride, forced her legs to move, and stepped into the small, windowless meeting room. The door clicked shut behind her. She sat stiffly in the chair across from Ethan, who, without a word, slid the termination paperwork across the table. The document was thick, filled with airline policies, official statements, and legal jargon. At the top, in bold, unforgiving letters, were the words "termination of employment, effective immediately." Danielle's fingers trembled as she reached for the pen. Ethan spoke, his voice calm, rehearsed. "By signing here, you acknowledge that you have been formally removed from your position due to violation of conduct policy, including inappropriate physical contact with a passenger." Danielle's chest tightened. Hearing it spoken made it feel even more final. She had spent years disciplining others, writing up crew members, watching people get suspended or fired for their mistakes. But she never imagined that one day she would be sitting on this side of the table. Ethan continued, "You also acknowledge that you will not seek reinstatement, nor pursue employment at any airline affiliated with our parent company." Danielle's vision blurred. This wasn't just a firing, it was a blacklist. Days ago, she was a senior crew member working first-class flights, handling VIP passengers, and now she would be lucky to find a job again. Her voice was a whisper. "Is there any way to appeal this?" Ethan didn't even hesitate. "No." Danielle's stomach churned painfully. She forced her trembling hand to sign the document. Ethan took back the folder, flipping through to make sure everything was in order. Then without any emotion he said, "You'll need to return your uniform and employee badge before you leave." Danielle felt a lump in her throat. She had worn this uniform for years, stepped onto hundreds of planes, greeted thousands of passengers, carried herself with confidence, control. It was her armor, and now she had to give it up. Ethan must have seen her hesitation because he simply said, "There's a changing room at the end of the hall." The security officer beside her shifted. a silent reminder that she had no choice. Danielle stood stiffly, her hands clenched into fists. She walked out of the office, past the employees who used to greet her with respect, past the people who used to admire her, past the people who were now witnessing her downfall. She reached the changing room, stepped inside and locked the door, and for the first time since this began, she felt her entire body tremble. It was over, the final step. Her hands were numb as she unpinned her name badge and placed it on the counter. Her uniform, the uniform she had worn with pride, the uniform that used to make her feel important, powerful, untouchable, now felt like a costume she had no right to wear. She changed her clothes slowly, her movements stiff and mechanical. When she stepped out, she was no longer Danielle Calloway, senior flight attendant, she was just Danielle, and she had never felt so small. She walked back to the office, handed over her uniform and badge, then waited. Ethan accepted them without a word, then nodded to the security officers. "She's done here." Danielle flinched at the phrasing, as if she was just another case, another problem dealt with. One of the officers gestured towards the exit. "This way, Calloway." Danielle slowly turned, forcing herself to keep her back straight, at least to pretend she had some dignity left, but as she walked through the terminal, as she felt the weight of the passengers' eyes on her, she knew they had all seen her leave the plane in disgrace, they had all witnessed her being stripped of her title, her authority, her career, her name, her face. They would remember, and no matter where she went, no matter how much time passed, this would follow her forever. She had spent years controlling others, but now she had no control over her own future, because the moment she stepped through those final airport doors, she would have nothing. Danielle walked through the sliding glass doors of the airport, the outside air hitting her face like a slap. For a brief moment she just stood there, gripping her bag straps so tightly her fingers went numb. She wasn't sure what to do. For years she had always known her next step, her next flight, her next schedule, her next crew assignment, her life had been structured, predictable, controlled, but now there was nothing. Her career was over, her name was tarnished within the industry, she couldn't even set foot on one of the planes she used to command. She looked around, expecting to feel anger, expecting the injustice of it all to burn in her chest, but she didn't feel anger, she felt empty. Passengers hurried past, rushing to find taxis, shuttles, loved ones waiting at the curb. People came and went, moving through the airport as if it were just another normal day for them. For her, everything had changed. She glanced back over her shoulder at the airport, where she had built her career, where she had reigned for years, the place that had just ejected her as if she were nothing. She had believed herself untouchable, that no matter what, her position, her experience, her authority would protect her, but all it took was one mistake, one moment of arrogance, of unchecked power. She had thought the passengers were the ones without control, that they were beneath her, that they had to listen, had to obey, had to accept whatever treatment she decided to give them. Yet Eleanor Gardner had done nothing, she hadn't yelled, hadn't threatened, she had simply waited, and in that silence, in a single message she sent to her husband, she had dismantled everything. Danielle exhaled, shaky and uneven. She didn't know where she would go from here, she didn't even know who she was anymore. For so long her identity had been her job, her uniform, her status. Without those things, what was left? She turned back towards the street, stepping forward as the reality truly hit her. She was no longer a flight attendant, she was no longer respected, she was no longer in control, she was just Danielle Calloway and she had nowhere to go. Danielle stood at the curb, staring blankly at the chaos of the airport pickup area. Taxis pulled up, doors popped open, travelers rushed in and out. A mother scolded her child for pulling their suitcase the wrong way, a businessman tapped impatiently on his phone while waiting for his ride, a young couple embraced after a presumably long separation. Life went on, but for her, it had stopped. She had spent years walking these same streets in her uniform, confident, important, entering employee-only entrances with a sense of authority. She had never been just another person waiting outside, now she was one of them. A taxi pulled up in front of her, the driver rolled down his window. "Need a ride, ma'am?" Danielle blinked for a moment. She had considered just getting in, telling him to take her somewhere, anywhere, away from this airport, away from what had just happened, but then she realized something. She had nowhere to go, no plans, no support system. Her entire career had been built around this job, this world, and now that world had slammed shut permanently. She had savings, but for how long? She had experience, but who would hire her now? The weight of her mistakes, her arrogance, her downfall pressed down on her chest. She shook her head at the driver. "No, I'm okay." The driver shrugged and drove off, his taillights disappearing into the endless line of cars coming and going. Danielle looked down at her phone, hesitating before unlocking it. No messages, no missed calls, no concern. She had been completely erased as if she had never worked there at all. Danielle gritted her teeth, scrolling through her contacts. She had connections in the airline industry, people she had worked with for years. Maybe someone can still help me find another position. Maybe I can get ahead of the news before it spreads too far. Her finger hovered over the first name in her call history. It was a former supervisor at another airline, someone who had always respected her work ethic, someone she had even trained when they were new. She pressed the call button. The phone rang twice, then a voice came on. The number you have dialed is currently unavailable. Danielle's stomach tightened. She tried another contact, the same response, then a voicemail. Her breaths came faster. They were already cutting her off. The industry was small, news traveled quickly. Charles Gardner hadn't just removed her from the airline, he had made sure she couldn't go anywhere else. Anyone will answer. She dialed another number, someone she thought she could trust. This time the call connected. Danielle's pulse jumped. "Hey, it's me," she said quickly. I need to talk. Something happened." A long pause, then a soft, uncertain voice replied, "Danielle?" The hesitation in that one word made her blood run cold. "What's wrong?" she forced herself to say, trying to laugh it off. A sigh came from the other end of the line. I don't think I can get involved in this," the voice admitted. "I heard what happened. I just think it's best if I keep my distance." Danielle's heart stopped. She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, click, the line went dead. She stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. Every name in her phone list blurred. They were all gone. Every relationship she had built, every favor she had earned, everyone who had ever relied on her, it was all meaningless. Now she was truly, utterly alone. Her hands fell limply to her sides. She had spent years making sure people respected her, feared her, obeyed her. She had pushed people aside, dismissed their concerns, treated them as if they were beneath her. And now, when she needed someone, there was no one left. She stood in an airport she was no longer allowed to work in, calling people who wouldn't answer, watching the life she had built slip through her fingers like sand. For the first time, a terrifying thought crept into her mind. What if this is the end? What if this isn't just the end of my career, but the end of everything I've built? Her identity was built on her job. Without it, who was she? A cold wind swept through the terminal, biting at her skin. She looked up at the airport, her airport, one last time, but it wasn't hers anymore. And as she turned away, stepping into the unknown, she realized something far worse than losing her job. She had lost herself. Danielle walked aimlessly, her heavy steps dragging across the cold sidewalk. The twilight shadows swallowed the city, but the dim streetlights were enough for Danielle to see the fragments of her life scattered everywhere. It wasn't just a job, but a whole person, an identity, a pride that had turned to ashes. She stopped in front of a small park, the bare trees reaching out in the cold wind. She sat down on a bench, her eyes blankly watching the dry leaves rustle and fall. "Who am I?" the question echoed in Danielle's head, unanswered. She was so used to being called Ms. Calloway, head flight attendant, to giving orders, to being respected by others. But now she was just an anonymous woman, unemployed, without a future. Suddenly, Danielle remembered Eleanor Gardner's calm eyes, remembered Charles Gardner's cold words. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice lost in the wind. She was wrong to judge others by their appearance, to abuse her power, to look down on others. She was too arrogant, too proud, and now she had to pay the price. But Danielle didn't want to wallow in regret. She didn't want to let the past drown her. "I have to start over," she told herself, a glimmer of hope flashing in her eyes. She didn't know where she would start, but she knew she had to do something. She had to find herself again, rebuild her life from the fragments. Danielle stood up, head held high, walking into the night. She was no longer the powerful Miss Calloway, but she was Danielle, a strong, resilient woman ready to face any challenge. She wouldn't let the past define her future. She would rewrite her own story, a story of redemption, of growth, of a new beginning. Her steps quickened, blending into the rush of people on the street. Danielle knew that the road ahead would be full of thorns, but she was no longer afraid. She had lost everything, but she had also learned a valuable lesson. Power is not something to abuse, but something to share. And respect is not something to demand, but something to earn.